U.S. drug policy for the past 30 to 40 years has been dominated by harsh measures such as minimum sentencing laws and broken windows policing. This so-called war on drugs has been waged primarily in minority neighborhoods. Recently, however, drug policy has softened, placing more emphasis on rehabilitation rather than enforcement. Does the shift have anything to do with the opioid epidemic that is ravaging white communities? In other words, has U.S. drug policy softened because the white community, now more than ever, faces the grip of opioids?
Can I go first on this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
So I think that's not the case. I think people are saying explicitly in denouncing the war on drugs that they're saying it's racist against minorities. I think a lot of leaders from these minority neighborhoods oppose it. So I don't think it's white politicians trying to keep other white people from going to jail. I think it's people who are concerned about minorities that are being put in jail on the war of drugs. Doesn't necessarily mean discriminates against minorities.
Well,
Well, I would say it doesn't necessarily go after minorities just because they're minorities. It doesn't necessarily mean that. But I'd say when people denounce the war on drugs, they do try to paint it as a racist thing, even if it's not actually.
Well,
so I won't say
okay,
just
so-
white people looking out for other white people.
So Nixon was the president who sort of initiated the war on drugs, correct? And I have a quote here.
Clinton administration too.
But before that,
But Bill Clinton was a big player in it.
Bill Clinton was a big player.
Advancing
Sure.
police force. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But Nixon was the one who sort of brought it about.
Yeah.
And I have a quote from a Nixon aide. It says, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." That's John Ehrlichman, assistant to President Nixon on domestic affairs, talking about the war on drugs and why the Nixon administration sort of brought it about. From the beginning, this has been a racist policy. This has been about disenfranchising minorities. It's basically the successor to Jim Crow.
Well, Richard Nixon's purpose in it definitely could have been racist, and given that quote, I'd say it was. But then you have to say Bill Clinton's a racist too,
Well,
and advancing
I'm not
the war on
saying
drugs.
that.
Okay, you think Bill Clinton's a racist? Yeah, he holds animosity against minorities.
I'm saying that
That's why he increased
saying-
police force. I
No,
think
no.
didn't he have bipartisan support? In
he did have
increasing
bipartisan
police
support,
force?
but that doesn't mean that
With
they were
minority
right in what
minority
they were doing.
politicians. What?
Oh, listen. So my point was that the drug war was at its roots a racist policy designed to
Yeah, at its
disenfranchise.
roots, but it could have been improved. And also, I think in practice nowadays, when we look back on it, it's not necessarily racist. It could do bad things for minority communities, but I think as a whole, it's just that more drug deals and stuff did happen in these poor communities that happen to be minority communities.
But so great, right? But that's starting to happen now in white communities. More and more whites are being are taking opiates, and they're becoming addicts, and that sort of behavior is becoming more and more prominent in the white community. And all of a sudden, we see a shift in drug policy in the United States where it's been more about recovery rather than punishment. And when this was happening in the black community, when the black community was being ravaged by the drug epidemic, everyone was talking about punishment.
I think that I agree with what Owen's saying. I think that one of the causes of that could be the socioeconomic status of minorities versus whites. So, for example, obviously in America, white people are generally better off. So I think that not only are they're better equipped to get their message out and haggle government authorities and stuff like that, but also in this world, money is power. So if you have more money, people are more likely to listen to you. So people are more likely to listen to the middle class man making $100,000 a year rather than for example, the Hispanic person living in a rundown town who's
Right.
just sitting on the side of the street. So I think that once this started affecting white people, they were obviously able to
Well,
respond
right.
in a way that was able to get them help, and they, I guess, their situation allows it, and their knowledge allows it to do it to a better extent than the lower class minorities.
No, do you want to say something?
Yeah, you can say something. I'll say.
Well, so
Sorry
you
for
mentioned
that.
money, and I just like to point out that this the drug war has been a boon for private prison companies. In the United States, 1 out of every 6 federal prisons is a for-profit institution, and this is bad for many reasons. One of them being that the state of Florida found that some private prisons cut their healthcare services by up to 50%. From public prisons, not public prisons, but prisons run by the government. And the Corrections Corporation of America spent over $14 million in lobbying from 2003 to 2010. They were working with groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a conservative advocacy group, which backs legislation like mandatory minimums for drug sentencing and other harsh drug laws. So you can see that there's a clear connection between the private prison companies and the drug war,
Well-
how they're sort of fueling the drug war, trying to criminalize it
Well,
so
now
they can make
this
more
is getting
profit.
kind of theoretical now. Now we're kind of.
This isn't getting theoretical. I have the numbers right here. 2003 to 2010, $14 million were spent on lobbying. This is according to MSNBC.
The drug war was around for a while. Is in the
drug war-
is
Right,
Like,
it was-
according to your
it was-
information. It started in the '60s. Is escalated in the '90s.
It started
under
in the
Clinton
70s.
administration.
It started in the 70s,
Okay.
late 60s, and actually the private prison industry sort of emerged in the 80s. So I'm not saying that
Well,
private
I think because more people have to be going to jail as a result of this policy, which is why people are opposing it now. And when people oppose it, I think the people who oppose these laws the most nowadays are liberal politicians that would agree, that maybe would say, that would probably say it's racist, okay? That would probably agree with you, okay?
Right.
So I don't think they're opposing it because white people happen to have more of a drug problem nowadays, okay? I
Well,
think they're opposing it
I
because
think
they
the
kind of
shift that
because
we've
they agree
seen,
with you whether or not it's right.
the shift that we've seen in drug policy, I think, has stemmed from the fact that all of a sudden this isn't just a minority problem, this isn't just a black problem, this is a problem that affects white people as well. And I think that's why we're seeing the shift. And I do grant you that younger people are sort of look at the drug war and they're like, what is this? Like, I don't understand this. This is, clearly a racist thing. But I think that, old-time politicians are going to look at this as differently through the lens
Yeah.
of race.
Yeah, I really think one of the reasons that it could have shifted is that, so as Owen said, when it shifted to white people, the problem shifted to white people, the federal government started to soften on they started to focus more on rehabilitation. And I
Right.
think that, so when you see someone who's poor using opioids, people might say, oh, he's poor, he has nothing better to do with his life. Or you say, like, maybe this guy didn't study in school, or he did it to himself. And then when you see a white person
Right.
who's rich and successful, or like
Middle
there are
class
people,
family,
yeah, middle
right.
class family,
It's
and
more of a
it
problem
comes out
with
of it comes
society.
out of nowhere,
Yeah.
and you're like, oh, she seems so happy. This person had a job, had a lot of friends, and then she just died of overdose. People are like, all right, this clearly isn't that. This is clearly a problem that just doesn't come from being poor. And I think once people saw that, they sort of they started to focus more on like the emotional side about why it's not just you're being poor or being rich. There's clearly something deeper than that that's causing people to use the drugs. And I think that's why they're investing more in rehabilitation.
So you think it's more has more to do with economic status than race?
Well, he's saying that it's more of like a problem with how society.
How
has-
society looks at
It's more of a
both.
problem with society when a middle class person, middle class teenager falls under the influence of drugs. It's more of a problem with society. But when it's, a black teenager who's grown up in the ghetto, it's more of a problem with that person. And we've seen this outlined by the way that the drug war has progressed, meaning it's gotten more lenient as more white people are addicted to drugs.
Or I think a lot of it has to do with kind of the time period, like how this has progressed over time, okay? So I think also a way to kind of explain how the drug war is dying down is that people are seeing the drugs expand and they just don't think it's working, so they want to try something else. It doesn't necessarily mean they're motivated by race or economic status. They could just be looking at the law the way it is. And some people would say the drug war worked. I think some people would say it didn't work. Doesn't necessarily mean either one is right. But I would say that it's not necessarily a matter of race or economic status. It could be a matter of like how effective the law was, and changing legislation. Having dynamic legislation. So if you see a problem with it, you can change it down later the line. Doesn't necessarily mean racism or classism, perhaps.